Hi everyone, my name is Ryan P. Johnson. Welcome to Western Civ 2. In today's lesson, we're going to examine a number of social movements that took place during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. If you're a current student in my class, as always, there's a quiz that accompanies this presentation, located in our course LMS. Please take a minute to access that quiz now if you haven't already. If you're tuning in and you're not a current student, welcome. I'm glad you're here, and I hope you enjoy and learn from this lesson. Whatever your status, please take a moment to like this video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to my channel. I think my students have had enough time to pull up the quiz, so let's get this show on the road, shall we? Today, we'll be exploring changes in culture during the post-war years. We'll examine important social movements like the Civil Rights Movement, the Anti-War Movement, and the Sexual Revolution. We'll also witness the end of the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union, and briefly explore some of the consequences of communism's collapse. In our last lesson, we discussed the prosperity Western Europe was experiencing after World War II. That prosperity will continue into the late 1950s and early 1960s. The economic boom in places like West Germany and France led to immigration in order to fill job openings. Many immigrants came from places in southern Europe like Italy, or from former colonies like Algeria. There were nearly 2 million immigrant workers in West Germany by the mid-1960s. Technological innovation also led to increasingly efficient farms. Farms in West Germany could produce enough to feed 5 people in 1900, but by 1980, those same farms could produce enough to feed 7 times as many people. This modernization of agriculture led to a decline in the peasantry. More money could be made in agriculture, and fewer people were needed as new machines began automating much of the work. So more people moved to industrial areas and sought jobs in towns and cities. Some worried about the erosion of a more traditional society, one in which agriculture was the backbone of the economy, while others grew concerned for farmers who could not afford machinery and could not keep up with the rapidly changing economy. Another economic development was the rise in the number of managers and other white-collar workers. By 1964, nearly half the entire workforce in some nations was occupied in government jobs, as bureaucrats of various levels. A skilled worker in the post-World War II era was now one that had leadership or mathematical skills, and women entered the workforce in larger numbers than ever before. Class distinctions began to blur due to increasing wealth. In previous eras, things like the clothes you wore or the items you bought clearly indicated your social class and made you distinct from those not in that same class. Rising prosperity, though, allowed people from the former lower classes to dress better and purchase expensive items. Additionally, class distinctions based on education began to disappear, as more and more young people went to school and attended university. Secondary school attendance doubled in some countries, and as we'll see later, universities had more students enrolled than they could handle. In Eastern Europe, the Soviet process of collectivizing agriculture took hold. Also, as we discussed in our previous lesson, the economic progress of Eastern European nations was tied to the success of the Soviet Union. The USSR sold goods to Eastern Europe at high prices and purchased goods and resources from them at low prices, leading to a massive transfer of wealth to the Soviet Union. As opposed to Western Europe and America, where the middle class was growing, in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, the middle class had withered due to communist ideology and the effects of 2 world wars. Most people were industrial workers, and any privileges available only went to high-ranking members of the Communist Party. Just as in Western Europe, education was important in the East, but there it was a matter of trying to unify a diverse society under a single set of ideas. The allure of nationalism was strong among the many ethnic groups that made up the Soviet Union, and communist leaders understood the danger that presented to the Union. Efforts were therefore made to subsume all other identities under a common Soviet identity, and education was one aspect of imposing that identity on the people. The prosperity Western Europe was enjoying, as mentioned earlier, created a consumer society in which more products were available for purchase, and in which there were more consumers who had the funds to buy those products. Refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, and washing machines began to show up in many more households as time wore on. Perhaps the most visible consumer item, though, was the automobile. In 1965, there were 40 million cars in Western Europe, as opposed to just 5 million less than 20 years earlier. Consumer society brought with it the development of the advertising and marketing industries, dedicated to stimulating the need to purchase products, thus creating and sustaining demand to keep the consumer society going. In Eastern Europe, consumer society didn't take hold due to central planning, which limited innovation and focused on heavy industry rather than consumer products. As I mentioned in the previous lesson on the Cold War, oftentimes after a long workday, those in the Eastern Bloc, mostly women, waited in long lines for a meager array of products, and shortages were a constant problem. Consumer society in the post-war years accelerated the expansion of mass culture. The term mass culture refers to a common culture among the great majority of people of all social classes. Mass culture first began near the end of the 19th century with the expansion of newspapers and sports. The process of replacing class-based recreational activities with ones everyone could enjoy continued during the post-World War II era. One of the driving factors of mass culture development was youth. In the 1950s and 1960s, young people, due to longer stays in school and a delayed entry into the workforce, spent less time with those of previous generations and more time with each other, creating important intra-generational bonds and developing a clear distinction between themselves and other generations. Music became the cultural hallmark of young people during this time, and unified people across national boundaries. Technological advances and consumer society led to radios and record players becoming cheaper, better quality, and more prevalent everywhere. Certain musical genres, like rhythm and blues, but especially rock and roll, were incredibly popular, and often spoke more to the lives of young fans listening in. British bands took American sounds and made them their own, and subsequently became popular back in the United States, with bands like the Beatles launching a, quote, British invasion of American pop culture. music even penetrated Eastern Europe. Though communist governments were more quick to censor things they felt went against the common Soviet culture they were trying to establish. There was even a renewed interest in older forms of music such as opera, as record companies released new versions of the classics for popular consumption. Speaking of recording companies, music wasn't immune to the advertising and marketing that was going on in other industries, as companies sought to push certain artists or sought after the next big thing in music that could sell records. A genre that grew in popularity during the post-war period was film. In Italy, filmmakers tried to capture what they believed life was really like, and created characters that were unpredictable. While in France, directors used improvisation to create a view of society stripped of all sentiment. The city of Cannes rebuilt itself after the war as a city of culture and artistry, and revived a film festival that has achieved world renown. However, due to greater financial resources and the devastation visited upon Europe, Hollywood took over as the world's premier movie producer. Cold War tensions, however, did impact the silver screen, as writers, directors, and actors came under investigation by the House Un-American Activities Committee, which was trying to root out alleged communism in America. Many were blacklisted by production companies after being called to testify before the committee. Additionally, the Motion Picture Production Code dictated what words and what kinds of imagery could be seen in movies. The importation of foreign films that escaped the code led to experimentation by American studios, and in 1952, the Supreme Court ruled that films were protected by the First Amendment. The spread of American music and American film began to worry some European commentators, who believed European culture was being taken over by American values and morals. This dynamic also had ties to the Cold War, as it was American money that aided Western Europe's recovery, and it was American military might that protected much of the world from communism, and it was America that led organizations like NATO and the United Nations. Some in the West resented the power of the United States and the influence America wielded, but oftentimes the threat of war, even nuclear war, kept such resentments under wraps. During the 1950s and 1960s, we see a number of important social movements emerge. These movements were influenced by the changes to society in the post-war world, and in turn began to change society themselves. One such movement was the sexual revolution and a renewed women's movement. The generation that grew up after World War II was more open to talking about sex and gender roles, and scholarship reflected that, with a series of reports coming out in the 1950s that examined sexual practice and demonstrated that what American society said about sex and what actually happened between people were not aligned. Young people also argued they should not be beholden to their parents' beliefs about sex, and that conversations should be more acceptable to prepare young people for the world. Consumer culture and scientific discoveries also contributed to the sexual revolution. Companies began creating a bevy of personal hygiene and glamour products, and aggressively marketed them to both men and women, but especially to women. Magazines contained pictures and articles on how to look your best and how to be attractive. Science also created the birth control pill, which was revolutionary not because it slowed the birth rate in the West, which had already slowed by this point, but because it gave women more power to control their own reproduction. In the 1960s and 1970s, many Western nations legalized both contraception and abortion. The women's movement of the 1960s was focused on sexual and reproductive freedom and a woman's role in both family and society. More women were entering the workforce and attending school, including university, and saw firsthand the discrepancy between the Cold War rhetoric of freedom from oppression and how women were held back by old notions of gender relations. New organizations like the National Organization for Women were founded to fight for the equal treatment of women in society. In the United States, the civil rights movement was gaining momentum. This paralleled developments in Africa, where many nations became independent in the 1960s, and men like Aimé Césaire and Leopold Sédar, as discussed previously, advocated for black culture and pride. The most prominent figure in the American civil rights movement was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a Baptist minister who used his oratorical skills to rally people to the cause of equal treatment for African Americans, especially the right to vote. King was not alone in this fight, though, as organizations like the NAACP, the Congress of Racial Equality, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee all played important roles in the movement. King adopted Mohandas Gandhi's ideal of nonviolent resistance to oppression, and some of the most harrowing images of the civil rights movement involved people, including law enforcement, physically attacking peaceful protesters. Not everyone agreed with King's methods, however. Malcolm X and his followers worried that if African Americans were integrated more into white society, they'd lose what made them who they are. They'd sacrifice their cultural heritage. He therefore advocated for black separatism, that African Americans should set up their own communities, their own businesses, their own churches, so they could be economically and spiritually free. Both leaders were assassinated for their outspoken beliefs. The movement they led yielded fruit in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, religion, sex, or national origin. It granted all Americans the right to vote and called for the end of segregation in schools and businesses. The Civil Rights Act did not end racism and discrimination, however, and many people of color are still dealing with the legacies of slavery, Jim Crow laws, and racism in the United States today. European nations also dealt with discrimination against minority groups in the post-war years. As previously discussed, the economic boom Western Europe was experiencing led to immigration to countries that needed workers. This led to people migrating from places like Algeria and Turkey to France and West Germany to find jobs. Minorities faced discrimination in pay, housing, and other areas in Britain, France, and West Germany, and at times tensions boiled over. In addition to the civil rights movement and the sexual revolution, there was also an anti-war movement that emerged in the 1960s, centered mostly on the Vietnam War. If you'll recall from our last lesson, French Indochina became 3 independent states after the French army was defeated in the 1950s. Vietnam was divided between a communist North and a Western-backed South. As North Vietnam began supporting rebels in the South, called the Viet Cong, the United States became more involved as they tried to follow through on the containment policy of keeping communism from spreading. U.S. President John F. Kennedy began increasing the number of first advisors, then troops, stationed in the country, a process called escalation. However, the rough terrain, hot and humid weather, and the guerrilla tactics of the enemy led to stagnation and demoralization. This stagnation, combined with ever-increasing numbers of U.S. troops, led to protests back home, as students at universities protested American involvement and men burned their draft cards in defiance. As the death toll increased and peace talks went nowhere, U.S. President Lyndon Johnson decided against seeking re-election, leading to the presidency of Richard Nixon, who had promised during his campaign to reduce America's role in Vietnam, but once in office, continued the policy of escalation. This led to more protests and reactions against them, including the deaths of 4 students at Kent State University at the hands of the Ohio National Guard during a peaceful protest. The involvement of students in the fights for gender equality, civil rights, and opposition to war brings us to the final of our revolutions to discuss: the student movement. Young people across both Western Europe and the United States were wealthier, becoming more educated, and were more socially conscious than previous generations of young people had been. The movement began in universities. The sheer number of students attending university in the 1960s was too much for university staff and administration to handle. Classrooms were filled to the brim, and college leaders could not effectively respond to every issue that came up. Generational differences also caused problems, as students questioned what they felt were outdated policies and examined the role of the university in the larger consumer society. "1968 proved to be a year of protest, as students and other groups demonstrated for their causes across the world. In Paris, masses of students demonstrated against the University of Paris. The university shut down, but the protests continued, garnering the attention of labor groups, who launched a general strike after police attacked unarmed student protesters. At its height, 10 million workers walked off the job. The government responded by increasing wages, which satisfied the workers enough to get them to end their strike. Once the students were isolated, their protest petered out and many went back to class. Protests also broke out in Italy against overcrowded schools and shut down over 24 colleges. In West Berlin, there were demonstrations against ties to the Shah of Iran, which led to violence between police and protesters. There was also tension in Mexico City over the 1968 Olympic Games, as many African nations threatened to boycott if South Africa, which had implemented the system of apartheid discussed in our last lesson, was allowed to compete. During the Games, American athletes Tommy Smith and John Carlos each raised a black-gloved fist during the playing of the American national anthem during their medal ceremony. In Vietnam, the Tet Offensive and the casualties it created sparked another round of anti-war protests in the U.S., and 1968 witnessed the assassinations of both Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy. Demonstrations also broke out in the Soviet sphere, most notably in Prague. In Czechoslovakia, Alexander Dubček rose to power, and it was his intention to lead more benevolently, to create, in his own words, quote, socialism with a human face. He eased censorship and allowed more open debate. Moscow thought he was a bit eccentric, but tolerated him, at least up to a point. The new Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev, was more of a hardline communist than his predecessor Khrushchev had been, and was less tolerant of change. When other communist leaders began paying visits to Dubček, Brezhnev began to feel that a plot was underway to destroy the Warsaw Pact, something he would not allow. He sent in tanks and troops to overthrow Dubček's government, purge anyone deemed not sufficiently loyal, and sent many officials to prison. This was the first move under the new Brezhnev Doctrine, which stated the Soviet Union could involve itself in the affairs of any Eastern Bloc nation as a means of ensuring good communist rule. In both this presentation and the last one, we examined the economic growth both Western and Eastern Europe enjoyed post-World War II. That growth would continue up until the mid to late 1960s, and then fall off in the 1970s and 1980s. Economic slowdowns in France and West Germany led to unemployment. Housing costs went up, as did spending deficits. The common market continued to expand, but there was tension between the desire to cooperate and create common policies and the desire of some nations to control their own affairs and not follow common rules. Additionally, in the 1970s, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries began an embargo against Western nations. This embargo raised the price of a barrel of oil nearly 30-fold by the early 1980s. Rising oil prices triggered a rise in many other products, and rising prices, in turn, led to demands for higher wages. When these demands were not met, strikes and other labor actions took place, causing tension between employers and their employees. Western European nations couldn't seem to find answers to these economic problems. In England, the government of Margaret Thatcher cut taxes to try and incentivize businesses, but problems remained. In West Germany, higher taxes for job training were tried, but problems remained. Some came to believe the economic issues were bigger than one nation alone could solve, and so further European integration was seen as a viable solution, that Europe-wide problems required Europe-wide solutions. In 1991, the European Union was formed, with a unified monetary zone, complete with a central bank, and common fiscal policies. In Eastern Europe, economic progress stalled due to the lack of innovation and too much emphasis put on heavy industry and military spending. Also, trade ties with Western Europe put some Eastern Bloc nations, like Poland, in serious debt. What consumer spending existed was rolled back even more in response, triggering social unrest. In Poland, a series of labor strikes coalesced into a trade union called Solidarity, which agitated against high prices of goods, poor working conditions, and for truly independent trade unions. The Polish government used military force against Solidarity, but it failed to stamp it out, and in fact created more sympathy and support for the labor movement. In the mid-1980s, the spirit of reform affected even the Soviet Union. In 1985, a new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, came to power. He was significantly younger than previous leaders and wanted to improve the conditions of life for people in the Union and the Eastern Bloc. He introduced two new policies which would have huge ramifications: perestroika and glasnost. The first, perestroika, was a policy of economic restructuring that entailed moving from a system that was strictly planned by the government to a more mixed economy that combined central planning with free market activity. With the second, glasnost, Gorbachev sought to reform Soviet policies by introducing competitive elections and allowing greater freedom of speech. Once the policy of glasnost went into effect, different ethnic groups within the Russian Federation began calling for independence, and Soviet military force was needed to suppress movements in places like Azerbaijan. The unrest within Russia, however, carried over into the Eastern Bloc, as many states began calling for separation from the Warsaw Pact and Soviet domination. In Poland, the Solidarity movement nearly swept the elections it was allowed to run in, and by 1991, the nation was holding completely free elections. Other Eastern European nations followed suit. Hungary's communist leader resigned, leading to a government seeking reform taking power. And by 1989, communist politicians had been removed from power. Czechoslovakia saw large demonstrations against the communist government, and a political party formed that wanted non-communists to be allowed to run for office. In December 1989, a new government took over as the communist regime fell. The most dramatic events, however, happened in Berlin. If you'll recall, the city had been separated by the Berlin Wall. In protest of the communist government, residents of both Berlin and East Germany began leaving for other nations that were moving away from communism. The communist regime in East Germany was replaced, and the new government allowed East Germans to migrate to other Eastern Bloc nations, effectively allowing them to migrate to the West. In November 1989, the wall was demolished, both by government contractors and ordinary people, who chipped off chunks of the wall for souvenirs. In October 1990, East and West Germany were officially reunited. Despite the fall of the Eastern Bloc nations, the Soviet Union remained. That would change, though, in the early 1990s, as the new president of the Russian Federation, Boris Yeltsin, was an opponent of Gorbachev and attacked the Soviet regime for the failure of perestroika to fix Russia's economic problems. The political attacks and the continuing deterioration of the Soviet economy, combined with calls for independence from various groups within Russia to weaken Gorbachev's position. A group of Soviet military leaders, sensing the regime was about to fall, made a last-ditch effort to hold the Union together. They held Gorbachev captive and attempted a coup, hoping to return the USSR to the way it was under more conservative leaders. However, they did not have control of the entire army, and Yeltsin led a resistance movement that denied them success. The coup failed. Gorbachev was released, but the momentum was on Yeltsin's side. Gorbachev watched helplessly as political moves were made independently of him. In 1991, Yeltsin and the leaders of Ukraine and what is today Belarus signed a document effectively ending the Soviet Union. Gorbachev retired on Christmas Day of that year, and the once mighty Soviet Union, that had helped defeat the Nazis and had been the most dangerous threat to the security of nations like the United States, simply vanished. Despite the euphoria of the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union, the immediate post-communist years weren't exactly easy. Trying to integrate Eastern European nations into the rest of Europe was more difficult than many people had thought. France initially resisted the reunification of Germany, and many West Germans were outraged when word got out about the East German Security Service's extensive spy network and the participation of ordinary folks in that network. Czechoslovakia quickly broke into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Every former Eastern Bloc state had economic problems, and some in the West resented needing to provide aid to help those nations catch up to where Western Europe was. Russia itself saw conflict among different ethnic groups, including a war in Chechnya, as rebels fought for independence. The Russian economy was also taken over by organized crime, and a black market emerged to replace the communist system. Yugoslavia, after the death of Tito in 1980 and the collapse of the Eastern Bloc less than a decade later, broke apart into a number of smaller states. This was a violent process that led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands. The largest state in Yugoslavia was Serbia, which came under control of nationalists led by Slobodan Milosevic. First, in 1991, Slovenia separated from Yugoslavia and was recognized as an independent state by Germany. Croatia then declared its independence, but war broke out between Yugoslav forces and Croats. This war was not only about Croatian independence. There was a religious aspect, as Catholic Croats fought Eastern Orthodox Serbs. The religious element helped fuel violence on both sides, and massacres began to take place. Some of the worst fighting, however, happened over Bosnia and Herzegovina. These were two of the most ethnically diverse regions in Yugoslavia, with nearly 50% of the population being Muslim. Yugoslavia, dominated by Serbia, and Croatia both sent armed groups to fight each other in Bosnia, and the Bosnians themselves built a makeshift army that fought against both forces. The Serb and Croat forces were more organized and better equipped, however, and Bosnia became the scene of terrible atrocities, including Serbia's practice of, quote, ethnic cleansing, as Serbian units murdered and terrorized Bosnian Muslims. The United Nations became involved, but could not stop the violence, as Serbians continued their ethnic cleansing and targeted civilians for mass murder. After 3 years of fighting, by 1995, over 200,000 people had been killed. Another round of fighting erupted over the province of Kosovo. This territory was the original home of Orthodox Serbians, but by the end of the 20th century, it was populated mostly by Albanian Muslims. Fighting broke out between the two groups, and more rounds of ethnic cleansing happened before Milosevic was finally ousted from power and arrested. He was put on trial for war crimes, but died before the trial was completed. The breakup of the Soviet Union and the collapse of communism were celebrated by many, though subsequent events have shown that peace is still elusive. That does it for our look at social movements during the Cold War. In this lesson, we examined economic developments like the emergence of a consumer society, the sexual revolution, civil rights movement, anti-war movement, and the student movement, the collapse of communism and the Soviet Union, and finally, some problems that emerged after communism had fallen. If you have any questions, please leave a comment below, or send me an email if you're a current student. If you'd like more information on the topics covered in today's lesson, here's a short list of books you can check out to get started. Also, please be sure to like this video, share it with anyone you think would enjoy it, and subscribe to my channel. Finally, if you're going to comment, do me a favor and don't start any flame wars. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you all again soon.